All right, so I have to start with a disclosure, which is that Nancy Sinkoff is one of my dearest, oldest friends. We met in college, and which was a long, long time ago, and miraculously have been able to remain friends ever since then. And she's been a very influential and important person in my Jewish journey. I mean, even though I was born Jewish and that was the beginning of my Jewish journey, my Jewish learning journey started with Nancy and has continued with her at my side all the way. So I am forever in her debt for that. And her credentials, because I think you guys like to hear this stuff. Nancy is a professor of Jewish Studies and History and is the academic director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University. She received a PhD from Columbia University and an MA from Columbia and from Jewish Theological Seminary of America as well. She lives in New York. She's currently quarantining, or whatever the word is, in the Adirondacks, getting close to nature there. And she's going to talk tonight about a book that she spent many years working on that is, I would say, a labor of love and passion from what I know of her. And so I'm very eager to hear her talk about it. The name of the book is From Left to Right, Lucy Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. Nancy.
Okay, so I'm going to thank everyone for coming. Particular thank you to Shoshana for inviting me. I've been to Becky many times, so I love it when I come to Westville and get to spend time in your shul, and of course with Shoshana and John, and back in the day with Ariel and Sam. So thank you so much, and I see some familiar friends as well, which I'm very grateful for. So I'm going to, it may get a little formal, it just sometimes happens. I like to be very prepared. So I am going to show PowerPoint and talk about my book. But before I put up the slides, I just want to explain something about who I am as an historian and what I do. So I'm an intellectual cultural historian of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and my work has focused on Poland. Both Poland in Europe, and if you will, the diaspora of East European Jews in the settlements outside of Europe. So my first book was actually on the late 18th century, early 19th century, pivotal moment in the history of the Jews of Europe with the partitions of Poland. And the Ashkenazic Jewish community in Poland was the largest Jewish community in the world. In 1772, 80% of world Jewry lived in the Commonwealth, and then became Austrian, Russian, and Prussian Jews. And many of those Jews from the Habsburg and Russian empires emigrated from those lands in the late 19th century to many places, but the most important diasporic settlement was in the United States, and particularly in New York. So just to give you a sense of this, in the interwar years, the city with the largest Jewish population was New York City, right? The second largest was Warsaw. That gives you a sense that this culture of East European Jews actually migrated with them and created sort of satellite communities. And this was true all over the world, but New York is the most significant numerically. And my work has always focused on how the Jews of Ashkenaz, these Eastern Ashkenazic Jews, responded to the challenges of the modern world. And modernity, which is one of these debated terms in history, didn't happen in one fell swoop. It happens constantly. It sort of gets iterated from the late 18th century with the partitions of Poland and the rise of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and other major events of the late 18th century until today. That is the questions about modernity, how to be a modern Jew, how to be a modern Jew of East European origin, remain among Jews who are thinking about themselves. And those are the kind of questions that have always intrigued me. So that's the kind of history I do. And so even though my first book was on the 18th century, and I'm happy to talk about that offline with anyone, this book, the book about Lucy Dawidowicz, which is about the 20th century, is actually not as far, they're not so removed from one another, actually. They're asking the same set of questions. But the answers, or rather the responses of these figures, is very different because the time and place is so radically different and so much has changed. But that's the arc of my own work, and that's why I was drawn to this topic. So, and I would argue I'm not a postmodernist, so if there's anyone out there who's a literary theorist who's very indebted to postmodernism, you should live and be well. But I am not a postmodernist, and I think the questions of modernity are still really the fundamental questions for Jews. And we'll see this as I'll try and convince you of that as I move forward. So now I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and let's see if we can do this. Shared? Yes? Okay, so there you go. This is my book. This is my cover of my book, which I'm very happy about. I can tell you more about that at another point. So from left to right, Lucy S. Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, is a biography, but it's not a classical biography of a figure's interior life or of her literary or historical works, although I analyze those, or even a detailed study of her politics, although her political journey is a key theme of the book. Rather, the book is a life study that illuminates the major issues of modern Jewish life, particularly refracted through the 20th century American diaspora and its contact and its connections with the European Jewish past to the post-war period in the United States. The book, okay, let's see if I can get this to move down. The book is structured in 4 parts that move back and forth between New York and Europe. And the movement echoes Dawidowicz's transnational identity as an American Jewish immigrant daughter committed to an East European diaspora nationalist vision of Jewish peoplehood, and her absorbing of European culture. So what is diaspora nationalism? Some of you may know that it was an ideological movement born in the 19th century, and it posited first and foremost that Jews were a people who shaped a culture, religion, and a civilization that sustained it during its long years of exile. And for the Jews of Ashkenaz, the 1,000-year-old Yiddish language represented the cultural distinctiveness and their vehicle for communicating who they were. And it was considered by many diaspora nationalists, that is Yiddish, to be an essential component of modern Jewish identity. And that was this ideology of diaspora nationalism profoundly shaped Lucy Dawidowicz. So I'm going to walk you through my book, its major parts, and I'm going to try and prove to you that Lucy Dawidowicz was the perfect vehicle to illuminate the major issues confronting modern East European Jews, both in the European heartland and in the diasporic settlements. And I would also argue facing Jews of East European origin in the modern state of Israel, but we can leave that for later. I'm going to focus today on the Jews of New York City, which was the largest settlement of East European Jews in the 20th century. So through Dawidowicz's life, I tried to address a lot of questions, which is why I worked on the book for so long. Some of those questions included, what is the relationship of self-consciously modern Jews to the Jewish religious tradition? How can a modern Jew balance individualism with belonging to a group? In other words, what place does Jewish peoplehood, often referred to as nationalism with a lowercase n, have in post-war diaspora life? What role does the commemoration of the Holocaust play or should play in shaping post-war Jewish life? And a subset of that is, how do we understand the assault against the Jews? Was it a particularist assault? Was it a universal genocide? What are the tensions there? Another question is, how should Jews relate to the politics and the leaders of their host country? It's a very apposite question for the moment we're in today. In terms of American history, this plays out in asking the question of what is the relationship of Jews of Ashkenazic origin to modern political liberalism, and particularly to the Democratic Party and its values? What are the limits, if there are any, of liberal American Jews' defense of the separation of church and state? How should and how did American Jews respond to the social movements of the late 60s, focusing on civil rights, feminism, and Jewish religious revival? Again, some of these questions are still very much with us. What are the role of intellectuals in shaping Jewish life? And lastly, what are the limits or not of diasporic criticism of the modern state of Israel. What's the relationship between what were two Ashkenazic settlements, right? The founding of the state of Israel was done by Jews of Ashkenazic origin as well. So all of these questions, I would argue, are the questions of modernity, some more 20th century than 18th, even though I started with that. And I would argue that they took on heightened urgency in the mid-20th century when the initial thrust of acculturation on the part of the immigrant generation was over, and new generations of American Jews of East European origin had to construct new forms of Jewish identity, and they sought to feel secure in the diaspora. In addressing these questions and thinking about them, my book put Lucy Dawidowicz's life in conversation with a group of well-known immigrant sons, the so-called New York intellectuals, and here they are, who grappled with these questions in many ways. And you can see them: Lionel Trilling, Irving Howe, Alfred Kazin, Crystal, Norman Podhoretz, he's still alive, Nathan Glazer, and Daniel Bell. Her life paralleled theirs. She was born in 1915. Like them, she was a youthful leftist. She became an ardent Roosevelt Democrat in the 30s and 40s. And then in the late 60s and early 1970s, as did some of them, although not all of them, she moved to identify with neoconservatism. Lucy Dawidowicz evolved politically, as I say in the title of my book, From Left to Right, but she was very different from these men. And that was part of what I was intrigued by. Why was she not in all the books about the male New York intellectual? Well, obviously not the male, but why all the books on the New York intellectuals never even make a nod to her? My book is the first study of Dawidowicz. Was it her sex, her unapologetic commitment to Jewish particularism, her amateur status, she didn't hold a PhD, her East Europeanness, her assertive temperament, or all of the above that led to a certain lack of recognition in the scholarship? So I wrote the book to place her life in explicit historical comparison with these famous men, and to ask what made her political journey different from theirs. And in so doing, I sought to shed light on a political tradition of Jewish conservatism that has been slighted, as she was, in the historiography. So in many ways, what I was trying to do was to ask the question, is liberalism a Jewish value? Now, personally, I may feel that way, but I was asking it as an historian. Is liberalism a Jewish value? My book claims that Dawidowicz's differences resided primarily in the fact that she encountered American modernity from solid Jewish cultural and linguistic ground, with a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. She was educated at diaspora nationalist institutions, such as the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute and the YIVO Institute, and they represented a vast transnational Jewish diasporic Yiddish-speaking world. She wrote in Yiddish, and even her later popular and scholarly writings, which were written in English, had a distinctly Jewish audience in mind. Where the male New York intellectuals saw their political commitments and transformations in American terms, Dawidowicz framed hers in relationship to East European Jewish history and politics. And she responded to the political and cultural challenges of the post-war years in terms of the long Jewish past. And she interpreted American Jewish communal needs within the parameters of diasporic Jewish politics. Lucy made two fateful trips to Europe in her early adulthood, the first to Poland in 1938 and the second to post-war occupied Germany in 1947. Her direct contact with anti-Semitism in interwar Poland, her work with Jewish refugees in post-war Germany, and her personal ties to individuals who had experienced the Soviet encroachment upon Eastern Europe permanently informed her critique of the New York intellectuals' liberal cosmopolitanism, which she ultimately came to regard as assimilationist and hostile to Jewish particularism and continuity. So I start the book when Lucy is an immigrant daughter, and I tell the story of her childhood, her adolescence, and her college years. And I argue that she inhabited two worlds simultaneously, that of the American urban landscape in interwar New York City, and that of East European Jewish immigrant society with all its social, cultural, linguistic, political, components. She lived in a total Jewish society that in many ways resembled the urban settlements of Eastern Europe. But she also participated in American institutions. She attended the prestigious Hunter College High School for Girls and Hunter College, a women's public college in New York City in the politically intense 1930s. At Hunter, she pursued a degree in English, and in 1934, she joined the staff of Echo, the college's literary magazine, and you can see Echo on the left side of your slide. By 1935, she had become editor-in-chief of Echo, and she was at that time a member of the Young Communist League, and the magazine took a left-wing turn. And you can see that by the bright red cover. Yet on the right side of the slide, you see her college graduation picture from 1936, in which she looks like, you know, everyone's nice Jewish girl, right? Nice Jewish Tochter. In this chapter, I also emphasize her involvement with Yiddish culture and with the term that has a lot of different meanings and is difficult to translate, which is called Yiddishkeit. And her relationship to secularism and Yiddish culture would undergo revision as she aged. Her hyphenated identity, I argue, informed everything about her life. Besides attending the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute supplementary Yiddish schools, she attended Camp Boibelik. And on the left side of the slide, you see the pamphlet for Camp Boibelik, which is now the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. And Camp Boibelik created a European environment for immigrant children. They swam in Yiddish, they did plays in Yiddish, they, you know, had marches in Yiddish, they had a UN-like color war at the end of the summer, all in Yiddish. And if you see, well, you can't see the slide, it's probably too small, but the brochure says that Camp Boibelik is the camp for children from the progressive Jewish home. So you can see that this Yiddish culture that she was involved in was leaned left, even if they were not communists, but everyone was sort of involved with the socialist zeitgeist of the period. On the right, you see one of my favorite documents, which is the document of Lucy writing to her good friend Evelyn Konoff. And she says to her, do you see that the typewriter comes from the Communist Party? And then in red ribbon, it says, Nieder mit der kapitalistische Gesellschaft, so leben der sowjetische Verband, right? Down with the capitalist system, long live the Soviet Union. So this is the height of her association with the communists. However, in 1936, shortly after her graduation, shocked by the cruelty and political hypocrisy of the Moscow trials, she left the YCL, the Young Communist League, and she never looked back. She did remain, however, devoted to Yiddish culture for her whole life. So this is her distinction. While the male New York intellectuals had alienation and cosmopolitanism to ground their worldviews, Lucy had Yiddishkeit, an intuitive, holistic sense of belonging to the Jewish people. And it set the stage for her remarkable decision to go to Poland in August 1938. So the next part of the book moves to Europe, and I talk about her year in Poland, then her years in New York City at the YIVO, which were European-like, and then her decision to return to Europe after the war to work with the JDC and the displaced persons camp. So what I'm arguing in the second section of the book is that this American immigrant daughter really gains, if you will, a European soul by her experiences in Europe before and after the war, and to some degree by working with the refugees at the New York YIVO during the war. And I'll talk more about all of this. She went to Poland to be a graduate fellow at the YIVO Institute in a program called the Aspirantur. The Aspirantur, let's get this slide to move, come on, there we go. The Aspirantur was a research fellowship program at the YIVO in Vilna, Poland. And you can just imagine, she's a youngish graduate student. She's the only American. You can see in the bottom of the slide, here she is, surrounded by all of these East Europeans, her teachers and fellow students. And on the left side here, you see in Yiddish the list of research topics of all of the aspiranten. And you can't possibly read it because it's far too small, especially if you're on your phone. But you have to trust me that it says Liebe Schildkret, New York. Schildkret was her maiden name. Yiddish press in England. She wrote about the Yiddish press in England for her topic. And here she is at the YIVO Library in those years. So here she is, and she is surrounded by the luminaries of Yiddish culture, including figures as great as Max Weinreich, Zelig Kalmanovich, Elias Cherkover, the poet Chaim Grada, and the other poet Avram Sutzkever, the Reusens. I mean, these are, again, in the world of Yiddish, these are huge figures. And she, at the same time, is beginning to wrestle with the meaning and the viability of secularism. Because it's important to realize that in the interwar years in Poland already, even the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Poland were acculturating linguistically to Polish society and Polish language. And if Polish Jews had had a natural life, it is undoubted that Yiddish would have disappeared. Not the way it did, it was murdered, but that Polish Jews were acculturating linguistically, and the world of difference between Jew and Pole was changing. But we don't know what happened because it wasn't allowed to happen. But she was aware, as were many intellectuals in the interwar years, that the world of secular Yiddish culture was beginning to suffer a kind of attrition. So she thinks about these things while she's already in Vilna. And so that's important to realize, that her wrestling or her contestation with Jewish secularism and Yiddish as a vehicle for Jewish continuity already begins in Vilna before the destruction of the Jews. And she was also very influenced by a figure whose name is Zelig Kalmanovich, who perished in the Holocaust, extremely important figure. She was influenced by him for a whole host of reasons, but one important one is that he had fled the Soviet Union, and he hated the Bolsheviks, and he hated communism. And he believed that Jewish culture had to have its own autonomous motor, that it couldn't be harnessed to any ideology. And she was indebted to him and writes about him to people at home about what an influence he had on her. She also, in those years, experienced street violence, which she called hooliganism. And the street violence in interwar Poland against Jews often radiated from the university. University students were often the predators against Jews. And I mention this because this sets in motion her own jaundiced view, if you will, towards the university as a safe haven for Jews and Jewish ideas. And by the way, again, some of this is very opposite now to some of the criticisms that people have about the politically correct culture on universities and the degree to which it does or does not understand Jewish culture. And I'm just throwing that out to emphasize that I think she put her finger on some of the most important issues that we're still grappling with today, even though she lived 50 years, 50 years ago is when all of this is taking place. And she's dead 30 years. So hooliganism on the interwar Polish street, anti-communism, wrestling with secularism, all of these things are starting or brewing in her life even before the war itself. Now, when the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed in August 1939, she gets a letter from the embassy basically saying there's going to be a war. Everyone knew that once the Red Army was not going to defend Poland, in fact, it had designs to carve up Poland, that the Wehrmacht, which was the most important army in Europe, strongest army, was going to invade. And of course, that's what happened. So the very end of August, Lucy takes a train from Vilna to Warsaw, to Berlin, and then to Copenhagen, because all the ports were closed. And the only way she could get back to the United States was by taking a boat from Copenhagen. And by the time she gets to Copenhagen, the war has broken out. The Germans have invaded Poland. They did so September 1st, 1939. Some of you will know on September 17th, the Soviets invaded from the east, and so Poland was once again effectively partitioned between two zones, the Nazi-occupied zone and the Soviet zone. When she got back to the United States, she was able to work at the YIVO Institute, which had a New York branch, a skeletal branch, and Max Weinreich, who'd been her teacher in Vilna, also fortunately had gotten out of Europe. That's a different story. So through the war years, she works at the New York YIVO. And you can imagine what it's like to work at an institution that's devoted to Jewish culture, Yiddish culture, Jewish scholarship, where all of your colleagues are living under Soviet rule, and they're watching what's happening as the YIVO is Bolshevized, as Marxist ideology takes over the ideology of diaspora nationalism, as certain main figures disappear. We later learn that anyone who was a socialist was, not anyone, but many socialist Jews were murdered by the communists. And they're watching in terror as this is unfolding. But those years, 1939 to 1941, if you will, were relatively safe for Jews physically, right? The Soviets, for the most part, protected Jews as individuals. They went after Hebrew, they went after Jewish culture, but they did not go after Jews. Well, of course, that changes with the invasion in 1941. So again, these refugees at YIVO, both Weinreich and the refugee scholars who get out and Lucy are watching as the war is unfolding. As Yiddishists, they have access to information before the American public, before the American Jewish public. And it's quite heartbreaking to read their little hints about about their foreboding. Both Max Weinreich and Lucy were known for their restraint. And so their writings of that period are just sort of restrained anguish, is how I would describe them. After the war, she continued to work at the YIVO, but then decided to return to Europe. And in 1946, she returns to work for the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee. And here you see a series of pictures that illuminate these years. She worked there for 15 months in both the American and British zones of occupied post-war Germany. And the middle slide shows you in Yiddish, again, a frontispiece of a journal that was published by survivor historians, amateurs, and professionals, putting together some of the first evidence of what had happened during the Holocaust, which they called the Holden. And the name of this journal is Von letzten Holden, which means from the latest destruction. So you can see that in their historical imagination, the Holocaust was a continuum, if you will, of past Jewish tragedies, right? As opposed to the word Holocaust, which kind of exits Jewish history, Holden is rooted in the way Jews understand the first and second temple, the destructions of the first and second temples. Again, that's a very interesting topic we could talk about. What's important here about this journal is not only that it published some of the first testimonies, but Lucy herself was instrumental in getting the Yiddish linotype for the publication. So already you can see that she is active in the study of history. She's helping publish works. And this was an important part of what she did working for the JDC. She also did something quite extraordinary. In the course of the post-war years, and again, this is another very big topic, it becomes clear that the Nazis' intent to destroy the Jews was also linked to their desire to destroy Jewish culture. Some of you may know that they plundered synagogues, libraries, homes, and they collected Judaica, and they collected books. And they shredded and burnt many of them, but they also saved many of them because they wanted to have evidence of what they had done. They were extraordinarily good documentarians. Some of the best footage we have, tragically, is from German photographers. And in Vilna in particular, which had a legendary libraries, they hired experts in Judaica who had trained in German lands, but they also tasked the prisoners of the ghettos to catalog books. And then these books were shipped to Germany, and the archives were shipped to Germany. And in the post-war years, they were discovered. And Lucy knew about them because working with the DP camps, with the schools in the DP camps, one of the things she had to do was get textbooks for children. It's a very long story, but basically Max Weinreich in New York finds out that there are books in the Offenbach Archival Depot in Frankfurt that have the stamp of the YIVO and the stamp of other Vilna libraries. He helps to get Lucy, and Lucy works to get permission to use her time at the JDC to catalog the books. And she goes to Offenbach. She works there tirelessly for 4.5 months as a JDC employee, and she catalogs all the books. And she and Weinreich, well, really Weinreich, figures out that they're going to make a claim to the US government before other restitution claims. And long story short, because I really know, I'm aware of the time, in July of 1947, 420 cases of books were shipped to the New York YIVO. and they included extraordinary treasures from all of Vilna's libraries, which were seen, however, as part of YIVO's property. That's, again, a complicated story today. But here you can see the members of the YIVO opening up the books. And it was an extremely emotional experience because some of the books had the imprints of the names of YIVO activists who had perished, including Kalmanovich and the Raisins. Max Weinreich saw some of his own books. I mean, it was like seeing the dead come alive. And so she was instrumental. And those books are all in New York today. I mean, various places, but they belong in the to the archive of the YIVO Institute. And the last thing I'll mention is that she also then worked for 6 months in the British zone. And some of you may know that there was a great difference between the American zone and the British zone, because the refugees in the American zone were oriented towards the United States and towards, they were supervised by the American government. In the British zone, which was overseen by obviously the British, there was an enormous problem because the British controlled Palestine. And the British wanted those refugees not to go to Palestine. So they did everything they could to try and prevent the illegal immigration to Palestine, illegal because of the white paper and illegal because of the heating up conflict between Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism. And so the British zone is a hotbed of Zionist activity. And Lucy wasn't a Zionist, so it was sort of something that she didn't really talk about in her writings. But in fact, she became beloved friends with a doctor, a British doctor, whose name is Pearl Ketcher. She's in the middle of the picture there. Pearl's an incredible woman. She ended up running the medical department for the DP camps that were set up for the Exodus refugees. For the Jewish refugees from the Exodus were sent back to Germany, and they were reinterned in DP camps in German lands, and Pearl is the one who supervised their health. So Lucy Dawidowicz, is really in the center of Jewish history in these years. She returns to New York, and she actually gets married shortly after she returns. Again, that's a bit of another story. She had fallen in love with a refugee from Warsaw, Shimon Dawidowicz. His first family had perished in Warsaw during the Holocaust. His daughter was a ghetto fighter. She sprained her ankle and stayed behind when the ghetto was burned to the ground. And this, again, is part of what kind of sears Lucy as a European. She's not a survivor. She knows she's not a survivor, but her world is one surrounded by the trauma of survivors. And she goes to work and does so for the next 2 years for the American Jewish Committee. So this part of my book talks about her becoming an American, which sounds a little ironic because, of course, she's born in America. But I argue that these 20 years is where she really begins to discover American Jewish politics, American Jewish concerns, American Jewish liberalism. And you can see her on the slide, the four topics that she devoted her research energies to. The issue of church-state separation. Again, it was really extraordinary for me to see that the American Jewish Committee was on the front lines of writing amicus briefs, I hope that's the right plural, or amici brief, for all the Supreme Court decisions about separation of church and state, of which there are many in the 50s and 60s. She was also deeply involved with what was then called Negro-Jewish relations and the civil rights movement, and therefore was on the front lines when the civil rights movement changed in the late 60s. The AJC was absolutely the center of fighting communism and was involved in the cultural wars, liberal anti-communist cultural wars. And she was also at that time writing book reviews and thinking about East European Jewish history, writing about it for the American public. And in 1967, she published her first major book, which is The Golden Tradition, Jewish Life and Thought in Eastern Europe. It's an anthology of primary sources. It's still in print. It's still very useful. And again, we live now, it's hard to imagine that at this moment, in 1967, this was a major work that brought to the American public, the English public, the diversity, the vitality of what had been lost. So it's a very interesting book because it's both a book that honors the East European Jewish past and commemorates its loss. And that really sums up in many ways her historiographic ethos. So it also put her on the map. The golden tradition put her on the map, and she began to be noticed by other intellectuals. It also was her ticket out of the American Jewish Committee, because she was hired to teach at Stern College of Yeshiva University based on the seriousness of her project. And at Yeshiva, she thought she was going to be teaching American history and social history. But in fact, she started to teach the Holocaust. And I have here the first page of her syllabus. And what's, again, important to realize is that it wasn't like it is today, where every major university has, for good and for bad, in some ways the focus on the Holocaust is maybe a problem, but every major university has a course on the Holocaust, right? It's a given, and maybe it will change, but at least for the last 30 years, it's been a given that most universities have courses on the Holocaust. Well, in 1969, if you were going to teach a course on the Holocaust, you had to figure out what to teach, what were your sources. And there weren't that many works in English that privileged the Jewish experience. A lot of the major works in those years were what was called perpetrator history, written from German sources and not sources on the Jewish experience. And so that is part of what motivated her to write the book that made her famous, The War Against the Jews. I want you to notice one thing, again, maybe for the questions later. Number one in this outline, and again, you may not be able to read it so carefully, it says antecedents and substructure from Mein Kampf to the Wannsee Conference. That's a very important statement because it's a historiographic argument. Lucy Dawidowicz believed that Hitler's intentions to destroy the Jews were already articulated with the publication of Mein Kampf in 1925. That's an argument which is called intentionalism, and it's an argument that got a lot of pushback, okay? So you should just realize that she believed that the ideas of anti-Semitism, which fueled the Nazi state and were articulated by Hitler already in Mein Kampf before he was chancellor, were a blueprint or the first step in a linear process that culminated in the Wannsee Conference and the decision to annihilate European Jewry. So just sort of take note of that, because that is not, in today's world, thinking about how we understand the final solution, it is not a view that is, I would say, accepted, although I would also say that people are, in today's world, there is much more attention to ideology than there had been in the 80s and 90s. So Lucy is at Stern College. She's teaching the Holocaust, and she begins the research on the book that made her famous, which is this book, The War Against the Jews. The War Against the Jews is a synthetic history, popular in the sense that it's not burdened by tons of footnotes. Again, in those years, there wasn't the explosion of resources. Remember, the archives of Eastern Europe weren't open to people as well, and she doesn't know Hebrew, so she's not really able to use the materials that are being collected at Yad Vashem. But it's a very, very readable book, and it's divided into two parts. The final solution of the Holocaust. And in my view, this book is a direct response to Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. Why do I say that? Because the book privileges the Jewish experience, the Jewish response to anti-Semitism. And Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is a reportage and a very slim book, but a very famous book that actually created a whole conflict among the New York intellectuals. But Hannah Arendt argued in Eichmann in Jerusalem, essentially argued for a functionary, bureaucratic prosecution of the Holocaust. She wanted to point out that all people would be capable of this kind of barbarism. Eichmann, if you remember, it becomes sort of a symbol of what she called the banality of evil. Lucy Dawidowicz argued against that. For her, Eichmann was a indoctrinated Nazi and a Jew hater. And also Hannah Arendt infamously, in my view, accused the Jews of Europe, that is the Jews, the functionaries, the men of the Judenrat, the Jewish police, of abetting and encouraging the destruction of their own people. This is, as you might imagine, a very fraught topic for historians. There is no doubt that there were cruel members, Jewish members of the Judenrat and of the Jewish police. But what's important to remember also is that the Judenrat, the functionaries who ran the ghettos, were appointed by the Nazis. And their performance of their duties was at the pain of death and reprisal against their families. And many men in the Judenrat did their best within a very limited spectrum of choice to protect the community as much as they could. And also, they did not know what we know. And that's, again, one of the problems, right? It's only in late spring of 42 that knowledge of what is going on in terms of gas chambers and mass annihilation are becoming known. And one of the most famous incidents of knowledge is that of Adam Cherniakov, who was the head of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto, which had at its height almost 500,000 Jewish prisoners. He was told to start mass liquidations of the Jews of Warsaw by the Nazis. He's the head of the Judenrat. And he decides to commit suicide rather than acquiesce to the Nazi demands. So Arendt, in her broad condemnation of the men of the Judenrat, was unnuanced, that's the understatement, and also never really asked the fundamental question about what choice did the men of the Judenrat have. And the other important problem with Hannah Arendt's work is that many, many Jews in Eastern Europe, particularly Jews in Soviet lands, never experienced the ghettoization and a Judenrat. Many of them were just mercilessly murdered by the Einsatzgruppen and members of the SS who moved into Soviet-occupied Poland in 1941. So this is a long-winded way of saying is that Lucy Dawidowicz had an axe to grind with Hannah Arendt, in my view. There's one little footnote in The War Against the Jews where she talks about Arendt's flagrant irresponsibility. And the whole structure of the book, I would argue, is a response to Eichmann in Jerusalem because it privileges, as I said, Jewish voices, because the whole second part of the book is Jewish responses, Jewish communal responses to the destruction. Okay, I'm watching the time, so I'm gonna jump. Am I gonna skip this? No. Okay, well, we'll stay here for 2 seconds and just tell you that the latter part of the book deals with the politics. Maybe that's what you came to this talk for, so ask me about it in the Q&A. But what happens in the late 60s is that Dawidowicz becomes increasingly tense or concerned about the ruptures in civil society. Again, we're living in crazy times, so I don't really know what to say about that. But watching the streets of urban America go up because of the radical civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against Vietnam, the calling in of the National Guard, all of the ways in which the city and the meritocracy and the universities had been vehicles for Jewish integration and Jewish mobility seemed to be threatened by these new social movements. And so she is one of a group of people that begin to withdraw their sense of commitment to those values of liberalism. They are nervous about the radicalization of the civil rights movement. They are nervous about the attack on the universities. They are nervous about the fragmentation of urban life. They are nervous about the uptick in anti-Semitism, particularly with the beginning of the critique of Israel after the Six-Day War. Israel being overly militaristic, the questions of the occupation. Again, the 60s are not like today, but a sense on the part of the New Left and certain aspects of the student movement that the Israelis are occupiers and the Palestinians are victims. And if you're going to fight against the occupation of Vietnam, then you need to fight against Israel. And the feminist movement, she was not sympathetic to feminism, but something like the resolution Zionism is racism, it had its first articulation in the feminist conference in Mexico City in 1970, in the 70s. So these social movements rattled her, and her experience of interwar Polish anti-Semitism, her sense of the university's complicity in anti-Semitism, her sense that intellectuals, if you will, could poison the masses, all led her, with some other people, Irving Kristol is probably the most important name, Norman Podhoretz, to withdraw their support from the Democratic Party. It takes a while, but by 1984, she now identifies with the Republican Party, and she actually gives a famous talk at the 92nd Street Y when she urges her fellow New York Jews to vote for Reagan. And this was a talk that was met with some controversy and certainly pushed her, I would say, in some ways, out of the canon of intellectuals that historians should pay attention to, because she becomes right-wing and articulates right-wing values. And she also believes strongly that American Jews should not voice their dissent of Israel. I have great correspondence between her and Irving Howe, her great friend in Yiddish culture, about the first war in Lebanon and whether or not American Jews, like American Friends for Peace Now, should take out ads in the Times. So again, some of these questions are really still with us, but she had moved by that point from left to right. I'll just close with the last slide, which is a slide of her memoir, which I had the great privilege to reissue in 2008. So this is not the original cover. This is a cover you can see of Lucy in Vilna. And it is a memoir of her time in Vilna, the New York years, and her post-war years in Europe. And this book is really an homage to Yiddish culture and to Jewish secularism. And I argue, again, just like Yiddish culture and diaspora nationalism were the bedrock of her identification with the Jewish people, it was Yiddish and Yiddish culture that she clung to and that she turned towards at the end of her life. I think she felt very alone. Her husband died in 1979. The American political landscape had changed. She didn't see much of a future for secular Yiddish culture among young people. American Jews had acculturated. The growth in Jewish life seemed to be an orthodoxy, which she had some romance about, but it wasn't who she was. And so she devoted her last years of life to trying to share the wealth of Yiddish literature with the American public. And she fundraised by herself to raise money for something called the Fund for the Translation of Yiddish Literature. And just recently, this marvelous book, The Memoirs of Glickel, one of the first great Yiddish memoirists we have from the 17th century. It was recently reissued in its fullness and based on a Hebrew version by Chava Torniansky. And as you can see on the right, that it was, the book was supported by a subvention from the Fund for the Translation of Jewish Literature, and the founder of this institute, of this organization, was Lucy Dawidowicz. So I hope I've given you a sense of this very complex woman who moved from left to right, from the world of socialist Yiddish culture to neoconservatism, and who witnessed some of the greatest traumas of Jewish life and tried her best to give a sense of the vitality of the civilization of East European Jews that had been destroyed. For her, that was the role of an historian, to give American Jews a sense of the weight, vitality, and creativity of the Jewish past. So thank you very much.
Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I don't have a line of questions. It could be that you were so clear that everybody didn't have questions.
That's all right, that happens.
But I can call for questions now. Let me see.
Let's check and see.
Yeah, Steve and Rachel.
Rachel, did you?
Yeah, Rachel Weisner has a question. Make sure to unmute yourself.
No, she doesn't have a question.
She doesn't?
It
No?
looks like she's saying no.
Okay. Okay, so David, go ahead.
That's your resident sweetheart?
Yeah, okay. And then after, David, after you will be Corey, okay? Go ahead.
Is there anything from Lucy Dawidowicz's writing that addresses her view on the other half of the Jewish world, the Sephardi Jewish world, that obviously she would have been, if not aware of before, aware of as it grew in its influence and participation in Israeli society? Do we have any idea of whether she had any thoughts about this at all, how it integrates with Ashkenazic society going forward, etc.?
So first of all, I think it's a great question because it really asks, I mean, it points to the fact that today, the modern state of Israel, its Ashkenazic legacy is just that, it's a legacy. And Amos Oz famously said, Israel's finally becoming a Mediterranean country, right? And as it moves forward, God willing, right, it is this Ashkenazic past, it's going to, is not so present, and it's become more and more Sephardi, although some of the Sephardim are becoming Ashkenazim. There's an expression in Hebrew, Mehith Ashkenaz, like the way the Sephardic politics has the kind of rigidity of Ashkenazic politics. To answer your question, she really, and by the way, a lot of the better work on the Syrian Jewish community, which is not really Sephardic, but on Thessalonica, we're only getting some of it in the more recent past. She didn't write much about it. In the War Against the Jews, she has a list of the numbers of people destroyed in various centers. And of course, Thessalonica is such a major center of Sephardic life, which was totally annihilated. But it doesn't really figure in her world. To be either fair or unfair, she inhabited a New York Jewish immigrant Ashkenazic worldview. And that's a big world, but I don't think she peeked outside of it very much. So, and about Israel, what's really interesting is she's not exactly a Zionist. She believed that Israel, and I say this in the book, and she wrote this to Irving Howe, she believed that Israel, the modern state of Israel, is not about its politics. She believed that's the embodiment of the Jewish people. That's how she viewed it. The Jewish people live in Israel, and therefore they need to be defended, period. That's where, and so it wasn't that she was an ideological Zionist. She believed that Israel had to be supported because that's where the Jewish people were.
Thank you.
Corey, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, Nancy. Thank you so
Hi,
much
Corey.
for sharing this. What a labor of love. I wanted to ask you actually about the experience, your own experience of researching her life and whether over time it changed you. Did you become more sympathetic with where she ended up, or and you're not in the same time and space as she was, and you remained in academia, so clearly there are differences, but I just wondered how absorbing her experience affected you.
Well, first, it's also a really great question. I think, if I had, that log that I'd like, well, you missed it before I was saying, I wish I'd taken a log, I'd written a daily log about watching late winter turn to spring to summer in the Adirondacks, which I did not do. A different person would have maybe kept a log of the writing process, but it was so demanding that I was like no other time. The topic, she sort of came to me in a lot of ways. I read her memoir in 1989. I was deep involved with my first book, which I finished, the book came out in 2004. I finished my dissertation in 96. So, I met her a long time ago, if you will. I read her memoir, and the memoir is extraordinary. And at that point, I was very involved, and I am very involved with Yiddish culture. So she spoke to me. I don't think I had a sense of the politics at all until I started to dig into her work and start to read her and see the themes of the politics. So I think one of the challenges when you get so close to a subject and it's a person as opposed to a Talmud, I'm looking at Steve, you have to be careful, right? Not to overly identify, you have to catch yourself. Are you being as critical as you need to be? Those are sort of that's what the trade, that's what our craft dictates that we do. There were many, many times when I would howl with what she said because it was, so smart, so smart and so prescient and so, anticipating some of the things that we're living through today. on the other hand, there were times when I'd read her and I'd say, you know, she's being myopic, or she doesn't get it. A little bit like the question about Sephardim. In the epilogue of the book, I try to address it. I try to, if you will, excuse my French, cover my butt, right? I wanted to make sure that critics of the book wouldn't say I was too sympathetic. You know, I wanted to be careful about that as an historian. She was, she did not really see, with the radicalization of the civil rights movement and with the upsurge in violence and with the aesthetics of the counterculture, which she did not like at all. You know, she's an old-fashioned Victorian, you know, she studied Victorian literature, you know, so let it all hang out was hardly her temper. You know, she went to Hunter College when everyone had to study Greek and Latin. I mean, you know, it was the core curriculum back in the day. You know, boys wore suits, you know, men were men and women were women. So she did not like the counterculture, and she was afraid of the radicalization of the civil rights movement. But I think, like many people, she sometimes mistook some externals for the internals. You know, there were always people on the ground in the civil rights movement, always African Americans who were afraid, who were against the Panthers, who articulated a nonviolent position. I'm not talking about King, I'm talking about Bayard Rustin and others. And she knew about that, but she sort of, once the movement became radicalized, she kind of put it in one place. Like she lost her nuance about that. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. The other place where she was, if not wrongheaded, but couldn't see straight, was about Jews living in the Eastern Bloc. We now know today, all the research and all the information that we've gotten since the late, you know, the 70s, 80s, and then with the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, there were many Jews who tried, in the context of those societies, to maintain their Jewish identities. They took a different shape and form than in the United States, where Jews were defined as a religion. Obviously, in the Soviet world, that was an impossibility. And she just couldn't think straight about them. So, for example, she is kind of merciless for Polish Jews who are involved with Polish Jewish historical writing and associated with some place called the the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. She just really couldn't understand that they were like birds on a wire. They were trying so hard not to get themselves killed, right, or purged, and yet to do something in the spirit of Jewish history. And she just, you know, because of her Cold War animus, because of her anti-communism, she just couldn't see straight. So, I mean, when I researched her, I could see that. I could see the blind spots, and I could be critical of that. You know, did she change me? I think maybe I'm making a statement that some of you will disagree with, but I think if you care about Jewish group identity and you're an American and you're also on the liberal and a Democratic, a Republican with a small r, you are faced with a conundrum of sorts because our society's values privilege integrationism. We believe in it. We believe in the amalgamation of peoples. That's good for America, right? So how do you maintain a position that being distinctive as a group is a value, and it's not based on race, and it's, you know, it's this complicated mixture of religion and race and calendar and history and memory, and Jews are white and Jews are upwardly mobile. So it's a difficult posture in the society as large to make a claim for Jewish distinctiveness, I would say. And I think I felt that earlier in my earliest years, you know, even in my college years, you know, where, how do you make a claim for that? And if you're not orthopractic and only hanging out and only in Orthodox settings, if you're in the world as a large, how do you articulate in an American way the value of that kind of group identity? And maybe, you know, please argue with me. So I think those questions motivated me early in my own life, continue to motivate me. It seems harder and harder. I mean, we could, you know, I don't think we want to go here, but, you know, watching what's happening with Jewish studies as a discipline and how it will change in the next 20, 30 years. I mean, I probably won't live to see it, but, you know, its value on the university level will change, right? Other fields, other groups will demand justly that they be studied and have centered it. So the place of Jewish studies on the college campus is going to change. It's already changing.
Wonderful
I hope
answer. Thank
Corey, I
you.
hope I answered that. It was like went all over the place.
Way, way more than.
Thank you. Ellen, you had a question? Can you unmute yourself? Can't hear you.
Yeah, no, I had the question. Thank you, Nancy. That was
Sorry. Yeah.
great.
Steve, not Ellen.
She, you know, given the importance of language, of Yiddish and culture and secularism for her, you talked about this a little in response, I think, David's question. Does Hebrew have any role at all, or it's either or? I mean, either you're with the kind of Yiddishist secular culture, or with the kind of Hebrew Israeli religious whatever.
No, she regretted that she did not know Hebrew.
Uh-huh.
I have a great, there's an exchange she has with Gershom Shalom. Wonderful exchange. It also fits in. By the way, if you guys, I'm happy to answer questions longer. I know I went long, and you're great people, but if you guys got to like go watch Netflix, I understand. I do too. But or make dinner, or do your laundry, or just lie down. That's fine too. She regretted not knowing Hebrew. You know, look, Hebrew's, as you know, it's not an easy language to learn. It's certainly not an easy language to learn in your 60s. You know, it was really foreign to her, but she regretted it. And she knew German, and she knew Yiddish, she knew English, she knew French. She relied on her husband for translations in the Golden Tradition for things from Polish and Russian. And she writes to Shalom, and it's really fantastically interesting exchange, because it has to do somewhat with Hannah Arendt as well. So, you know, Arendt and Shalom were extremely close. And then after Eichmann in Jerusalem, he broke with her. And because it's a very famous exchange about how can you love a people, and they were incredibly close. And Dawidowicz and Shalom weren't close like that, but they got to know each other. And at one point, something of hers was published in Hebrew, and she needed a translation. So they have this back and forth. And they also have a back and forth about the figure Nathan Birnbaum. It's fascinating. It's short letters, but so interesting, and about Martin Buber and his tales of the Hasidim and things like this. But she says at one point, you know, I regret I don't know Hebrew. So no, Hebrew was vital to her intellectually, but she didn't have access to it. She didn't have.
Quick question. Did she have children?
No children. Shimon, her late husband, had 2 children, Zarek and Tobcha, or Toby, and they both perished. And they were married, when they got married, she was 33. And again, in today's world, but in those years, and he was 20 years older than she was. He was 53. So they didn't have children. She had 2 nieces she was devoted to. And in fact, her niece is someone who gave me a lot of the personal papers that I used for the book. I'll tell you one other thing, sorry, I can't help it. It's just me. So when I was looking at the Shalom Dawidowicz correspondence, and I wrote a piece about it, and a friend of mine who lives in Israel, she said, and he's obsessed with Shalom, and he said, why don't you check Shalom's library and see if if the War Against the Jews is there, if there's a copy of the book. Well, Shalom's library was historically a separate part of the Hebrew University library. There's a whole stink about whether or not, anyway. So I look in the catalog, and you can actually, there's several catalogs, and you can look at an older catalog that will tell you the provenance of various books. So I was able to find the copy of the War Against the Jews that actually belonged to Shalom, as opposed to anyone's copy. I'll never forget. And my friend, I think my friend did it for me. I can't remember now. It doesn't even matter. The book comes up from the stacks, and a picture's taken, and it's inscribed from Lucy Dawidowicz to Gershom Shalom and to Fania. So they remained in touch even when he broke with Hannah Arendt. So that really didn't answer your question. It just didn't.
No, that's very good. That was all very interesting. Thank you. The Shalom is very interesting.
Nancy, we had a comment that I'm going to just interject based on part of your answer to Corey, when you were talking about American liberal values, meshing that with Jewish exceptionalism, etc. And the comment was from Sarah Berry, and she said, America isn't really a melting pot, we're a salad. A salad is best when you can identify the different vegetables.
Well, I think that, and Sarah, Becky, you think that, but I would say hybridity or intersectionality, pick your, word du jour. I think it's one of the challenges of being able to assert that. And I believe that too, but it's not always a comfortable position to be in, which is okay. We can be uncomfortable, but asserting it, and particularly I would say in our moment or the last, where Jews are perceived on the wrong side of certain kinds of issues because of their perceived socioeconomic status and their perceived color of their skin, all the things that code Jews in a certain way in the popular unnuanced imagination make it difficult. I mean, maybe not for you, but I think for many people to assert Jewish distinctiveness. And the other issue is, the whole question of schools, right? So, sending your kids to a Jewish day school, which is good for Jewish continuity and Jewish community and the learning of Hebrew and knowing the Jewish calendar, right? I think we can all agree those are good things. But that means withdrawing from the public school system, right? And the public school system is the great vehicle of integration and is the great vehicle of civil society and had been a great vehicle for the middle class. So when Jews withdraw from those civic institutions to safeguard their groupness, there are tensions there. And we can look at the Eruv, right? Look at the Eruv in various neighborhoods and how that affects property values. Look at the more extreme examples of Kiryas Yoel, right? And the expansion of the Haredi neighborhood. So that, I think, is what I'm getting at, is that Jewish groupness has a fallout in civic institutions, and that those civic institutions were classically defined as, what liberals supported.
I work with anthropologists, so we tend to.
Who's that? Who's that?
That's Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. I don't
Hi.
see.
It's her comment. It was her comment.
Yeah.
So
I work with anthropologists, so we do tend to think that the differences are enhance the and being able to look at the differences.
Right.
Is a good thing. But yeah, you're right. Along the same lines, when people decided that segregation or busing and the rest of it was bad, and then all the rich folks started pulling their kids out of public schools, they went downhill.
Right. Well, first of all, anthropologists, you guys are a whole different beast, and wonderful beast. But historians and anthropologists, there's some interconnection, but the methodologies and the assumptions of the crafts are different. And the whole question of groupness, and segregation, separate is never equal, but we also know that some of the historic Black colleges, for example, did a fantastic job of educating their people, and integration has a cost. And that's, again, these are all issues that I think many of us grapple with. Integration has a cost. It's not that it's wrong-headed, it's that, boundaries and group identity needs to be protected. How do you do that? How do you do that in a non-discriminatory way, right? How do you remain open but secure? I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think these are the questions that I wake up and go to sleep with and feel crappy about half the time.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next question, we have a couple more questions and comments. Our next question's from Rena. Rena, you still here?
I saw her come in, but I'm not sure. She may have left.
She may have left. Well, I can tell you her question because she actually typed it out. So let me get back to that. Her question was, can you talk a little of how Lucy became either a Zionist or a supporter of Israel in some way? If you'd prefer, since she's not on now, I can just forward that to you and let you respond.
I think I kind of addressed it. She's sort of a non-Zionist supporter of the people of Israel. It's and it's really the new left. It's really the criticism, the assumption that Jews are now militaristic. How quickly the American public seem to have switched their allegiances from, the victimized Jews of the Holocaust and the right of Jews to have a state and the legitimacy of sovereignty to a pivot where the Jews are now the bad guys and they're predators. And this switch in the political discourse of the late 60s among the left and the children of the left is really what began to change her. And also she had friends in Israel. I mean, I mentioned Pearl Ketcher. She corresponded with her for 40 years. So again, and these, she corresponded with Zalman Shazar in Yiddish. I mean, there are lots of interesting connections, but she was a New York Jew. The idea of sort of picking up and moving to Israel was sort of unfathomable in terms of, her cultural comforts, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Joanne, you had a question? Don't forget to unmute yourself. Joanne, are you still here?
No.
Joanne Rudolph? Are they still here?
Yes, we're still here.
Okay. You're on. Joanne, you need to get closer to the mic, please. Joanne?
Can't hear you, Joey.
Oh, she's coming closer to the
I'd
computer. There we
like
go.
to know what your sources are. You mentioned some private correspondence. Where are the archival materials that you used?
Oh, you are so wonderful. That is so great. This is what I've been waiting for. Well, I used 45 archival collections for this book, which, by the way, proved my intuition is that she was important. When I first started writing about her, I tell people, they're like, oh, Lucy Dunn. But really, when she wrote her book, The War Against the Jews, it was big reviews in the New York Times when where again, there weren't like 50 media outlets. Everyone read the New York Times book. Anyone literate read the New York Times book review. Now, who can even read it? There are 50 million other things to read or not read for that matter. So her main quote papers are at the American Jewish Historical Society, which used to be in Waltham, Massachusetts, and now is at the Center for Jewish History in New York. So that is where her papers are. But every time, and I went through all of them, every time I encountered something in them that mentioned, she kept all her correspondence. So for example, if I saw that she corresponded with Sidney Hook or Alfred Kazin or Maurice Serkin or Norman Podhoretz or Israel Goodman, I mean, I can go on and on, Noam Chomsky, right? I would then try and get the other side of the conversation in the letter, because I often had their letter to her, but I didn't necessarily have her letter to them, although she also kept, because remember carbon copies, she kept a lot of her own stuff. So then I would write to all of those archives, by the way, I'd look through their finding aids. So that's how I found the correspondence with Gershom Scholem, for example. I had Scholem's letters to her, but I, wrote, figured out how to write to, my colleagues in the Hebrew University. And then at some point I noticed some photographs and I noticed this name, Lori Sapikoff, and a good researcher. I mean, look, everyone does this. You sort of snoop around, you figure things out. And I realized she had this niece. And I found, I guess I used the white pages. I didn't remember, but I called her on the telephone. And I said, I'm writing a book about your aunt. And she was like, I think she was really surprised. She knew her aunt was important, but she was a kid. And she lived then in Westchester. She's an attorney. And I drove up, I remember, because it was like dark and I had to figure out where I was going, which I hate. And I always get lost. And I got to her house and she gave me 6 boxes. And the boxes had all kinds of treasures in them. It had passports, photographs from Munich, her train tickets, her original application to the YIVO. And so and then lots of personal letters and sometimes some letters that could have been in the official archives. I mean, there wasn't so much rhyme or reason. So I went through all of those. I had a big Excel spreadsheet of dates and who, and, and then I searched in other places. So for example, she worked at the American Jewish Committee, I said, for 2 decades. And they have a digital archive, and I was able to go out to Cincinnati. And what I discovered is that she had written all these memos. And the reason I knew she had written them, because at the end of the memo, it would say LSD, which of course she thought was hilarious, that her initials were LSD, right? But there were hundreds of them. So those were the sources. And then there were some public talks that were taped, and she did an interview on something called The Open Mind with Richard Hefner. You know, there were other things, but I actually, when I finished the book, I finished it because I said, I'm not looking anywhere else. Because every time I looked, I would find things. Really, every time I looked. So I said, that's it.
Thank
Just
you.
can't stand it anymore. I have to stop looking.
Okay.
And what did you do with those boxes when you were all done?
Well, you know what, I still have them. Partly it's because of COVID. Because I talked to the archivist of the American Jewish Historical Society and said, I want to give you these. You know, they should be reunited with her, with the other archive. Then COVID struck. And then also there's part of me that thinks like, maybe I should just hold on to them because if I want to dip into, so I have them. But they belong in an archive, and the archive can take better care of them. One of the problems, I mean, again, this is a sidebar, but you sometimes when you give things to archives, unfortunately, if they don't have a staff to do a finding aid and add, sometimes this stuff just sits there. And it's not the fault of the archive, it's just the problem we have today with enough people to do that kind of painstaking work of creating finding aids and stuff like that. Yeah, but there's great stuff in there. I have her passports, pictures, a lot of the things that are in the book come from there, the photographs in the book.
I would like to say, I think we should wrap it up because Nancy, you have gone above and beyond as you usually do. And I really want to thank you for this talk, and so interesting. And I'm sure people will be, talking about it and thinking about it. The book I sent out with the announcement about today's schmooze, you can buy the book through the Wayne State University Press, and there's a discount code in the email. So, and I did it myself. It was very easy. And normally, Nancy would be speaking in person and we'd have piles of books for her to sign and we'd sell them. So please, if you're interested, please buy the book. We are not having a schmooze next week because it's Tisha B'Av. We'll be lamenting. And the following week, we will hopefully not be lamenting. And Raina Sotsky and Morris Bell are going to talk to us about, they're both psychiatrists, and they're going to share their insights on the psychological effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure will also be very interesting. And thank you all for coming. And Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't disappear. I was trying to figure out how to save the chat because there was some questions there.
I did save the chat.
Okay, I saved it and I don't know where it went into some folder.
So I can email that to you. If you
thank you, Daryl. So all you Beckyites, I hope that I can see you in person, have one of your wonderful kiddish lunches again.
So do we all.
Oh my God.
We hope we can make them again.
Yeah.
No, we'll be able to make them. The problem is when we'll be able to be together. So thank you so much. And if you have other questions, I worked on this book a long time. I figure I can answer questions for a long time.
And you're doing a lot of talks. So how can people find out about your other speaking?
Well, Wayne, if you go to Wayne State, I'm doing, or write to me. I'm doing something for my own shul next week. Okay. A little short talk. I'm doing some of the American Jewish Committee the following Tuesday morning. Yeah. So, yeah, I am. This is where it is. You can't see people, so you got to get it out there.
Right. Great. And we'll leave the Zoom open if people want to talk to one another, but we'll let Nancy go and listen to the crickets or whatever it sounds like in the Adirondack.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great.